History books celebrate great leaders and epic battles, but they ignore the secret wars that truly built our world. For every famous emperor, there was a forgotten rival whose challenge forced innovation and change. These hidden rivalries, the dramatic power struggles history forgot, shaped everything from our laws and languages to the very cities we walk through today. By the end of this journey, you will see the entire tapestry of human progress in a startling new light, revealing the invisible hands that guided our destiny. Why were the personal feuds of master builders erased from the records of their magnificent cities? How did a clandestine war between scribes and storytellers decide which version of the past would survive? The foundations of our modern world rest upon contests you were never told about. What does it say about our own time that the most transformative conflicts are often the ones left out of the story? The air in the ancient marketplace is thick with the scent of spices and the murmur of 1,000 conversations. Yet beneath the surface commerce, a different kind of exchange is happening. Whispers pass from merchant to customer, a silent currency of information about two powerful families whose growing animosity is starting to dictate the price of grain and the safety of the trade routes. This is the true theater of forgotten rivalries, not the battlefield, but the spaces in between where influence is won and lost long before any official chronicle takes note. These are the unseen forces that built our world. They are not the grand wars with clear dates and famous generals, but the subtle, relentless contests of ideology, economics, and pure personal ambition that fundamentally redirected the course of civilizations. As historian Dr. Elena Vance observed, the most transformative rivalries are often those that leave no monuments, only a changed world. So why are these power struggles so easily erased from our collective memory? Often it is because they were fought between individuals, not nations. Their outcomes were too complex and messy for the simple, heroic narratives that leaders prefer to inscribe in stone. In many cases, the victors made a deliberate effort to scrub their rivals from the record, systematically erasing the legacy of the loser to claim sole credit for a shared achievement. Consider the profound difference between an overt war, with its declared enemies and celebrated triumphs, and this kind of covert competition. It is a silent war waged in the designs of a city or the pages of a religious text. The scribes and historians of the time, often employed by the winning side, become the ultimate curators of memory, shaping the story to highlight certain heroes and obscure the conflicts that truly forged the era. With the passage of centuries, the personal animosities that fueled grand projects fade away, leaving behind only the magnificent and seemingly inevitable results. Picture two master architects in a nascent empire, each vying for the emperor's favor to design the new capital city. One championed grand or inspiring avenues to project power, while the other argued for clever, defensible walls to ensure survival. Their bitter personal struggle played out in whispered arguments in court and sabotaged models, yet the final city plan, a breathtaking fusion of both their visions, became the defining architectural style for generations. The rivalry itself, however, was lost. How would our understanding of that iconic skyline change if we knew each dome and corridor was a compromise born from clashing egos? This hidden dynamic forces us to question every official story. It reveals that our most cherished monuments and institutions were not born from singular genius, but were often the children of conflict, the unexpected offspring of a feud that history chose to forget. And if these personal struggles could so profoundly shape the physical and social structures of the ancient world, what invisible forces are shaping our own? That silent standoff on the ziggurat steps was not an isolated moment. It was the visible peak of a deep, structural fault line running through the heart of early civilization. The rivalry between the priesthood and the monarchy was a constant, grinding tension over a single, priceless commodity, the mandate of the gods. Who truly interpreted divine will? Was it the king who led the armies, or the priest who read the omens in a sheep's liver? This struggle was the engine that drove the creation of the first bureaucracies, the first written legal codes, and the very idea that power could be divided. The famous law code of Hammurabi, often presented as the edict of a sole ruler, was in many ways a political document, a public compromise designed to balance the demands of a powerful temple class with the authority of the palace. He had to demonstrate that his justice was divinely sanctioned, yet administratively separate from the temple's direct control. This contest had a brutal economic reality. Temples and palaces were not just spiritual and political centers. They were the largest economic institutions, competing fiercely for land, labor, and the tribute from harvests. A king who threatened the temple's wealth risked a quiet, devastating form of rebellion. Priests could wield prophecy and omens as political weapons, declaring that the gods were displeased with the monarch's rule, thereby turning public opinion and the loyalty of the army. Sometimes this Cold War turned hot. In the Mesopotamian kingdom of Isin, fragmentary clay tablets hint at a dramatic event where a king's overreach, his attempt to confiscate sacred temple treasures, sparked a priestly revolt that did not just remove a ruler. It toppled an entire dynasty and installed a new royal line, an event so sensitive it was nearly erased from the official record. So what does this mean for our idea of the divine right of kings? It shatters the illusion of absolute, unchallenged authority. The concept was not a fixed doctrine handed down from heaven. It was a perpetual negotiation, a fragile truce that had to be constantly renewed through ritual, shared power, and economic concession. The very structure of our modern governments, with their separate branches and systems of checks and balances, contains a faint, ancient echo of this primordial struggle between the spiritual and the secular. If the fight for divine authority built the framework of law and state, then what happens when the battle shifts from the temple to the library, from faith to pure knowledge? The quiet groves of ancient Greece and the serene mountains of China were not sanctuaries from conflict, but its newest arena. Here, a different kind of war was waged, one fought not with swords, but with syllogisms and paradoxes. This was the battle for the human soul itself, a fierce rivalry between philosophical schools that would dictate the moral and intellectual direction of entire civilizations. In the bustling agoras of Athens, the Platonists and the Sophists engaged in a fundamental clash over the nature of truth. Was it an absolute ideal to be discovered, as Plato argued, or a relative tool to be wielded through persuasive speech, as the Sophists claimed? Their public debates were a form of ideological combat, drawing crowds of citizens and powerful patrons. Rhetoric and logic became the sharpest weapons, each side refining its arguments in the heat of opposition. A thinker with a solitary idea might develop it in isolation, but a thinker challenged by a rival is forced to sharpen it, defend it, and make it comprehensible to others. This dynamic was even more pronounced in the warring states of China, where the practical philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism offered competing visions for a harmonious society. Confucianism championed strict social order, ritual, and duty to the state. Taoism, in contrast, preached natural spontaneity, effortless action, and a retreat from rigid structures. Their competition was not merely academic. Rulers, seeking the best formula for governance and stability, would patronize one school over another, elevating thinkers to positions of influence and effectively making philosophy a matter of state policy. This rivalry forced a synthesis of ideas. Concepts from one school would be absorbed and reworked by another, creating a richer, more complex intellectual tradition than any single school could have produced alone. Yet the stakes of these high-minded conflicts were intensely personal. Within the broader Taoist tradition, a little documented feud between two masters created a lasting schism. One master advocated for a life of complete hermetic withdrawal from society, seeking harmony with the natural world in isolation. His rival, perhaps a former friend, argued that Taoist principles should be used to engage with statecraft and guide rulers. Their personal animosity, now lost to time, crystallized into two distinct branches of thought that still influence spiritual practice today. This is the hidden engine of intellectual history. The losing schools often saw their texts suppressed or quietly absorbed by the victors. If your most deeply held beliefs about ethics, society, or the meaning of life were ultimately shaped by the outcome of a long-forgotten argument between two thinkers, how would that change your sense of intellectual heritage? We inherit not a pure stream of thought, but the sediment of ancient rivalries. And just as ideas were forged in competition, so too were the physical monuments of empire, born from a clash of egos as monumental as the structures they created. The grand philosophies of Greece and China were ultimately carved in stone, made permanent by the master builders who served rival city-states. Two cities rise on opposite banks of a great river, their skylines locked in a silent, escalating dialogue of ambition. Each new temple, each taller spire, is not merely a tribute to the gods, but a direct challenge shouted across the water. This was an architectural arms race, a competition in stone and mortar where the desire to outbuild a neighbor became the primary engine of technological progress. The Roman architect Vitruvius understood this dynamic, observing that the greatest works are often born of a sheer desire to surpass a rival. This relentless one-upmanship forced breakthroughs that solitary ambition might never have achieved. The need to construct a wider arch to support a heavier dome, or to design a more complex aqueduct to supply a growing population, pushed the very boundaries of known mathematics and materials science. Engineers studied the failures and successes of their counterparts across the river, not with admiration, but with a fierce determination to improve upon them. The fundamental arch, a revolutionary structural form, was perfected not in isolation, but through generations of builders trying to outdo each other's public works, creating ever larger and more stable civic spaces. This competition extended far beyond monuments. The same rivalry that produced breathtaking temples also spurred the creation of massive defensive walls and sophisticated irrigation canals, projects that required advances in logistics, labor management, and urban planning that benefited the entire civilization. At the heart of this race was a frantic recruitment of talent. City-states would poach skilled artisans, stonemasons, and engineers from their rivals, offering immense rewards and prestige. The knowledge these individuals carried with them became a form of high-stakes intellectual property, their expertise directly translating into a city's ability to project power and divine favor. A grander temple was the ultimate propaganda, a physical manifestation of a ruler's legitimacy and their god's approval. Yet this obsession with monumental building came with a terrible price. The economic strain of financing these colossal projects could cripple a state's treasury, diverting resources from the military or food stores. A city that poured all its wealth into a single, magnificent ziggurat might find itself defenseless when famine or a real army arrived at its gates. The very project meant to ensure a dynasty's eternal glory could become the cause of its swift collapse. consider a forgotten contest between the ancient builders of Thebes and Memphis. Historical fragments suggest a secret competition to raise the most perfect, most durable obelisk. This seemingly simple challenge demanded innovations in quarrying, as engineers devised new methods to extract single pieces of granite without fracturing them. It required breakthroughs in transportation, involving the construction of massive barges and the engineering of slick pathways to move these multi-ton stones from the quarry to the river and finally to their sacred sites. The final obelisk, standing tall in the sun, was more than a monument. It was a taunt, a physical message encoded in stone, proclaiming a temporary victory in a war of architectural wits. Every ancient ruin we walk among today contains these hidden messages, these echoes of a long, silent rivalry that pushed human ingenuity to its limits. The stones themselves tell a story of one city's pride and another's burning desire to exceed it. And just as these city-states competed for glory in stone, they soon realized that true power flowed not only through their grand avenues, but along the winding, vital routes of commerce that connected the world. The grand avenues of competing city-states were paved with gold, not just with stone. That gold flowed through the hands of merchants who answered to a power often greater than any king, the relentless logic of profit. On the murky docks of a medieval port, a different kind of sovereignty was being asserted. A guild master in fine wool watches as his cargo is unloaded, his eyes carefully tracking the king's tax collector who tallies each barrel. Their exchange is a quiet war of numbers, a subtle dance of deception and negotiation over customs duties and trade monopolies. This was the economic Cold War between private enterprise and state power, a constant, low-level conflict fought in ledgers and backroom deals that would fundamentally shape our modern world. The entire concept of national wealth was born from this protracted tug of war. An anonymous Venetian merchant's diary captures the essence of this relationship, noting that the king's crown is heavy, but it is balanced on the chests of gold we choose to lend him. The royal treasury needed the merchant's capital to fund its armies and ambitions, while the merchant guilds needed the state's protection and legal framework to secure their vast, sprawling trade networks. This tense symbiosis forced financial innovation. The need to fund risky, long-distance voyages led to the creation of the first joint stock companies, allowing risk to be spread among many investors. The complexities of international trade and the constant need for credit gave rise to early banking systems, with families like the Medicis becoming power brokers who could make or break kingdoms with a single loan. The guilds wielded their own formidable weapons to maintain an edge. They protected trade secrets with lethal seriousness, guarding knowledge of navigation routes, crafting techniques, and supplier networks. They established exclusive trade agreements that created powerful, private monopolies on goods like spice, silk, or salt. In response, the state flexed its muscles by imposing heavy tariffs and taxes, and in moments of desperation, through the ultimate betrayal of debt repudiation, simply refusing to pay back the colossal sums it had borrowed. This rivalry sometimes spilled out of the counting house and into the open, funding rival political factions and even financing explorers to find new trade routes that could bypass the established control of a powerful guild. A compelling example, largely scrubbed from royal chronicles, was the forgotten struggle between the Hanseatic League and the Danish crown. The Hanseatic League was a sprawling network of merchant guilds that dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas. When the Danish king sought to control this lucrative flow of goods, the League did not raise an army. Instead, it wielded economic sanctions, blockading ports and strangling the kingdom's income. They funded privateers to harass Danish ships, turning the sea into a battlefield of commerce. This was a war fought with balance sheets and letters of marque, and its outcome determined the economic destiny of Northern Europe for centuries. So if the economic foundations of your nation were laid not by the visionary decrees of a single ruler, but by this messy, protracted struggle between merchants and monarchs, how does that alter your perception of history? It reveals that the very idea of an economy was forged in conflict, and just as the control of wealth was a prize fought over in secret, so too was the mastery of the knowledge needed to count it, to map it, and to ultimately understand the world. The power to control memory is the ultimate power. Inside a quiet scriptorium, the scratch of a quill on parchment captures a single, frozen version of events. Just beyond the walls, under the open sky, a master storyteller breathes life into a grand epic, his voice rising and falling with the emotions of a tale that changes slightly with every telling. This was the silent war for a civilization's soul, a direct rivalry between the scribe with his pen and the oral historian with his living memory. The transition from fluid, spoken word to fixed, authoritative text was a revolution that created our modern sense of history, but it was a messy, contested process that erased as much as it preserved. Plato himself warned that writing was a dangerous invention, a crutch that would destroy our natural capacity to remember. His fear reveals the core of this ancient conflict, a fundamental disagreement over what knowledge truly is. Is it a living, adaptable story that serves the community in the present moment, or is it an unchangeable record, a permanent truth for all time? The rise of scribes created a new intellectual elite, one loyal not to a tribe or a tradition, but to the ruler or temple that employed them. Their power came from controlling the official narrative, and they often viewed the older class of oral historians, the bards and griots, as unreliable relics. The clash was inevitable. An oral history is inherently flexible. It emphasizes narrative flair, heroic deeds, and moral lessons that resonate with a contemporary audience. It adapts to fit the needs of the present. A written record, however, is rigid. It often reflects the specific agenda and biases of the patron who paid for it, freezing a single perspective onto the page. This difference created two competing versions of the past. In many cases, literate authorities made a deliberate effort to alter or suppress vibrant oral traditions that did not align with their new official history. They saw these fluid stories as a threat to their centralized power. Yet the outcome was not a simple victory for writing. In a fascinating compromise, many early scribes attempted to capture the spirit of the oral performance. They wrote in a rhythmic, poetic style meant to be read aloud, creating hybrid texts that were both fixed on the page and evocative of the living voice. A profound example of this schism played out in an early African kingdom, now lost to the main historical record. The king, seeking to consolidate his rule, commanded his scribes to compile a single, authoritative written history of the royal lineage. This new scroll, however, directly contradicted the genealogies and founding myths carefully preserved by the tribal griots for generations. The griots' version included older, perhaps less flattering, branches of the family and different accounts of territorial rights. The court was suddenly divided between two incompatible pasts. The king's written record claimed the authority of permanence, while the griots' spoken words held the authority of deep tradition. This created a silent, unresolved tension in the very heart of the kingdom, a crack in its foundation that no official decree could ever fully mend. If the first written history you encounter was created specifically to discredit an older, spoken one, a haunting question remains. How can we ever know the true past? The fight to control memory was never really about the past at all. It was always about dictating the future, and as civilizations secured their stories in ink, a new and even more volatile rivalry was brewing, one that would harness the very forces of nature to unleash a power previously reserved for the gods. The same stars held two completely different futures. In the hushed quiet of an observatory, two scholars could look at the same celestial arrangement and see opposing realities. One, the royal astrologer, saw a divine script written in light, a message foretelling the king's fortune in an upcoming war. The other, an astronomer, saw a clockwork of breathtaking precision, a set of physical laws waiting to be decoded. This was the ultimate contest for cosmic authority, a hidden rivalry that pitted destiny against mathematics and shaped the very tools we use to understand our universe. The astrologer's craft depended on a universe intimately connected to human affairs, where the stars directly influenced the fate of individuals and empires. The astronomer, however, was slowly piecing together a vision of a vast, impersonal cosmos governed by predictable mechanics. For centuries, these two pursuits were not separate professions, but warring siblings locked in the same body of knowledge. The brilliant Claudius Ptolemy perfectly embodied this tension. His intricate models of planetary motion, which stood for over 1,000 years, were used with equal fervor to predict the positions of planets for scientific observation and to cast precise horoscopes for Roman emperors. The same mathematical tables that could forecast an eclipse could also be used to determine the most auspicious day for a coronation. This strange union fueled profound progress. The insatiable demand from kings and popes for accurate astrological readings provided the steady funding and political cover for centuries of astronomical observation. Rulers wanted to know their futures, and they paid handsomely for the advanced telescopes and detailed star charts that such predictions required. This patronage, driven by superstition, inadvertently bankrolled the painstaking data collection that would eventually prove the astrological worldview false. The rivalry for a monarch's favor was intensely personal. A court astrologer's power rested on his ability to provide compelling, if ambiguous, divine counsel. The rising astronomer or natural philosopher offered a different kind of power, the ability to predict celestial events with unerring accuracy. In a small Renaissance Italian court, a dramatic confrontation unfolded. The prince's trusted astrologer, after consulting his charts, warned of a coming comet that signified divine wrath and urged a delay of a military campaign. A young mathematician, using newfangled calculations, instead predicted the comet's path would not cross their lands and posed no omen. When the comet appeared exactly where the mathematician said it would, the astrologer's influence crumbled. Patronage shifted from celestial divination to empirical calculation. The prince's decision to march to war based on that single debate may have altered the borders of a nation. This was the hidden stakes of an abstract argument. The slow, reluctant divorce of astronomy from astrology was a battle fought over every new discovery. When Galileo's telescope revealed moons orbiting Jupiter, it was not just a scientific triumph. It was a weapon that shattered the idea of a perfect, Earth-centered universe, directly challenging the astrological principles that depended on that very model. The fight to map the heavens was really a fight for the human mind, a struggle to decide whether we lived in a universe of meaning or a universe of mechanism. And as we finally learned to read the clockwork of the skies, a new frontier of rivalry opened up, a desperate race to chart the blank spaces on the maps of our own world. That silent war for the heavens created the very tools needed to conquer the earth. Inside the sealed chart rooms of rival empires, the world was being redrawn not with telescopes, but with pens dipped in ambition and outright deceit. A Portuguese mapmaker's private confession captures the essence of this new battlefield, writing, "We do not draw the world, we draw the king's desire." These men were not mere geographers, they were agents of information warfare, and their maps were weapons designed to secure treasure, territory, and a crushing psychological advantage. Coastlines were shifted, entire mountain ranges invented, and phantom islands carefully inked into existence to lure rival ships onto false courses or into claiming worthless tracts of ocean. This cartographic rivalry became a primary engine of the age of exploration. An English captain, clutching a stolen Spanish map hinting at a vast southern continent, would risk his fleet to find it, only to discover empty sea. A Dutch navigator, skeptical of a Portuguese chart that showed an impassable reef, would find a clear channel and a new trade route to the Spice Islands. Discovery was often born from the urgent need to verify a competitor's lie. The most powerful weapons in this silent war were the secret maps held by state-sponsored trading monopolies like the Dutch East India Company. These were classified documents treated with the same secrecy as military plans. Leaking one was an act of treason, and obtaining a rival's was a coup worth a fortune. They contained truthful, precise navigational knowledge, the real currents, the safe harbors, the seasonal winds, all to give their sponsors an unbeatable commercial edge. This practice reached its most audacious form with the deliberate insertion of entirely fictitious places. Competing Spanish and English maps of the New World, for instance, both featured a different, non-existent strait of Anian. This was a fabricated waterway supposedly cutting across North America, a northwest passage to the riches of Asia. Each empire's cartographers drew it in a location that best supported their own territorial claims, creating a geographical ghost that drove expeditions and fueled colonial ambitions for centuries, all based on a shared cartographic myth. This manipulation extended beyond physical geography into the realm of justification. Vast, inhabited continents were depicted on European maps as empty spaces, terra nullius, or were filled with illustrations of monstrous creatures to signify lands that were uncivilized and ripe for the taking. The map was not a record of what was there, it was a blueprint for what the empire intended to make of it. If the very charts that guided the great explorers were instruments of deception, how many celebrated voyages of discovery were actually just moves in a long-forgotten cartographic chess game? It reframes the entire narrative, revealing that the heroic age of exploration was also a clandestine age of disinformation. The control of where things were and who knew about them was the ultimate strategic asset, a truth that would define the next great struggle, not for land but for the very air we breathe. The scent of cinnamon and cloves was worth more than gold, and the men who controlled it held a power that could make kings tremble. In the shadowy ports of the Indian Ocean, a relentless economic war raged, a clash not of armies but of ledgers and cargo manifests. On one side stood the state-sponsored monopolies, colossal enterprises like the Dutch East India Company, armed with exclusive royal charters that gave them the legal right to dominate the spice trade. Arrayed against them were the independent merchants, a loose network of private traders, smugglers, and pirates who operated in the gray areas of the law, driven by pure entrepreneurial daring. This was a fundamental conflict over who would reap the astronomical profits from a global craving for flavor, the risk-taking individual or the treasury of a distant crown. The stakes were incomprehensibly high. A single successful voyage could bankroll a fleet, while a single failure could mean financial ruin or a noose on the gallows. The sheer pressure of this rivalry forged the very bedrock of our modern financial world. To manage the immense risk of sending a ship on a 2-year journey to the other side of the world, merchants developed the first sophisticated forms of marine insurance, allowing them to spread potential losses. The need to lock in prices for goods that would not arrive for years gave birth to futures trading, where contracts for pepper and nutmeg were bought and sold sight unseen. The Monopolies responded with brutal efficiency. They wielded their state-granted power like a cudgel, using naval squadrons to blockade ports, search private vessels, and seize any cargo deemed illegal. They enforced their control with a chilling slogan that trade follows the flag, meaning commerce existed only under the protection and permission of their cannons. To break the grip of these corporate giants, rivals engaged in a desperate form of agricultural espionage. The most famous example was the French mission to secretly steal live clove and nutmeg plants from the Dutch-controlled Spice Islands, smuggling them to their own colonies in places like Mauritius and Zanzibar. This act of botanical theft, a quiet declaration of war, eventually broke the Dutch stranglehold and sent spice prices plummeting across Europe. Consider the largely forgotten cinnamon war between private Arab traders and the Portuguese crown. For decades, Arab merchants had controlled the flow of cinnamon from Ceylon. When the Portuguese arrived, they did not seek to trade. They sought to conquer and monopolize, building forts along the coast and attacking any Arab dhow that dared to carry the precious bark. The Arab traders, in response, did not surrender. They fought a guerrilla war on the waves, using their superior knowledge of the local monsoons and hidden coves to run blockades and continue their trade. This was not a single, glorious battle, but a protracted series of skirmishes and acts of economic sabotage that determined the flow of wealth for a generation, yet it remains a footnote in the grand histories of empire. Every time you sprinkle pepper on a meal, you are tasting the final outcome of these centuries-old battles. The very presence of these spices on your table is a direct result of smugglers who defied royal decrees and merchants who risked everything to undercut a monopoly. This struggle over flavor was a proxy for a deeper ideological conflict about the nature of wealth itself, a question of whether it should be concentrated by the state or dispersed through individual enterprise. And as the world grew smaller, this economic friction would ignite a new kind of rivalry, one fought not for control of trade routes, but for the very minds of the people who walked them. The scent of wood smoke and drying clay hangs heavy in the air of the workshop, a familiar perfume of tradition. Here, a master potter's hands move with the unconscious grace of decades, his fingers tracing patterns his grandfather taught him. His voice is low and firm as he argues with a younger man, a guild brother who has returned from a distant trade fair, buzzing with ideas about a revolutionary kick wheel that could double their output. This quiet, daily conflict between traditionalist artisans and the innovative guilds they belonged to was a schism in the very soul of a civilization's craft, a battle over the future of making things that would dictate the pace of progress for centuries. The guilds were originally created to protect standards, to ensure that a master's title meant something, and to guard the secrets of a trade from outsiders. But this protective instinct could curdle into a deep conservatism. The sanctity of tradition was not just about quality, it was about maintaining the entire social order. The master's authority, the value of his product, and the slow, deliberate path of apprenticeship all depended on things staying the same. Innovation was seen as a direct threat to this delicate ecosystem. The guild statutes of many European cities are littered with explicit bans, forbidding the use of newfangled devices like the gig mill for raising cloth nap or certain types of looms, not because they did not work, but because they worked too well, threatening to make old skills and the men who possessed them obsolete. This resistance forced change underground. Ambitious artisans began developing new technologies in secret, in locked back rooms or after hours, knowing that discovery could mean expulsion from the guild and the loss of their livelihood. This internal pressure sometimes became too great, leading to the formation of breakaway guilds or sparking violent, localized protests. We remember the Luddites of the 19th century, but for every one of their rebellions, there were a dozen smaller, forgotten acts of sabotage. A tanner might find his vats mysteriously contaminated, or a cabinet maker might discover his new set of specialized planes smashed to pieces, a quiet warning from traditionalists who saw his efficiency as a betrayal. The apprenticeship system itself became a key weapon in this struggle. By controlling the flow of knowledge, the guild elders could effectively suppress innovation for generations. A young apprentice was taught only the approved methods, and any deviation was punished. The path to becoming a master was so long and arduous that by the time a craftsman earned his freedom, the conservative ways were often deeply ingrained. Yet the walls of the workshop were not impermeable. Trade fairs acted as cultural lightning rods, exposing isolated artisans to a world of competing techniques and creating an unbearable pressure for change. A weaver from Ghent, seeing the finer, more colorful cloth produced in a rival town using a different dye process, would return home with a dangerous new idea. This tension between stasis and progress directly influenced the distinct regional styles we now celebrate as cultural heritage. The intricate patterns of a specific lace, the unique glaze of a particular pottery, these were not always inevitable artistic evolutions. Often, they were the frozen residues of a local compromise, the outcome of a long-forgotten battle over which techniques would be allowed to survive. A specific and bitter conflict erupted between the weavers of two competing Flemish towns, Ypres and Ghent. The weavers of Ghent began adopting a larger, more efficient loom that could produce broader and more lucrative bolts of cloth. The weavers of Ypres, clinging to their traditional, smaller looms, saw this not as progress but as an existential threat. They launched a fierce economic and legal battle, arguing that the new loom produced an inferior product and violated guild agreements. The conflict grew so heated it split the larger weavers' guild, leading to years of lawsuits, tariffs, and even street fights. In the end, the efficiency of the Ghent loom proved too powerful to suppress, and its adoption gradually redefined the entire textile industry of the region, consigning Ypres and its methods to a slow decline. So when you admire a beautiful piece of historical handicraft, a tapestry or a piece of furniture, you are not just looking at an object, you are looking at the ghost of a compromise, the final terms of a truce in a silent war between the past and the future. The object's very form is a testament to a struggle between the hands that wanted to preserve and the minds that dared to improve. A hushed chant echoes in a torchlit grotto, far from the grand processions honoring the state gods. Here in the shadows, initiates of a mystic cult seek a direct, ecstatic connection with the divine, a personal salvation the official temples could never offer. This was the underground war for souls, a profound rivalry between the public religion that upheld the social order and the secret faiths that promised individual transcendence. The state religion existed to legitimize power, to ask the gods for bountiful harvests and victory in battle on behalf of the entire community. The mystic cults offered something far more intimate and dangerous, a promise of secret knowledge and a blessed afterlife available to anyone, regardless of their station in life. The Roman historian Livy captured the sheer panic of the establishment when describing the government's brutal suppression of the Bacchanalia, a wildly popular cult of Dionysus. He wrote of the state's fear that these secret gatherings were corrupting the very morals of the people and creating a state within the state, a network of allegiance that bypassed family, class, and even loyalty to Rome itself. This fear led to waves of intense persecution. State authorities deployed spies and informants to infiltrate these closed circles, identifying leaders for arrest and execution. Belonging to a banned cult was not a minor heresy, it was often treated as treason. The cult's survival depended on absolute secrecy. Elaborate initiation rites and coded symbols were not just spiritual theater, they were essential security measures designed to build unbreakable loyalty and protect members from discovery. This spiritual underground held a powerful appeal for those left on the margins of the official religion: women, slaves, the poor, all who were offered a starring role in a divine drama from which the state cult excluded them. In response, the state religion often engaged in a subtle form of absorption, a spiritual syncretism designed to neuter its rivals. It would adopt the most popular elements of a persecuted cult and weave them into the official dogma, effectively co-opting the appeal of the underground movement. A powerful example of this entire dynamic played out in the long-forgotten rivalry between the mighty Egyptian state priesthood of Ammon and the burgeoning popular cult of Osiris and Isis. The state religion of Ammon was focused on the pharaoh's divine right to rule and the cosmic order known as Mot. It was a religion of power centered on massive temples and a rigid hierarchy. The cult of Osiris and Isis, however, told a story of murder, resurrection, and a final judgment of the individual soul. It was a faith of personal morality and hope for an afterlife that was not reserved solely for the pharaoh. Initially, the state priesthood viewed this popular movement as a threat, but they could not stamp it out. Over centuries, the themes of the Osiris myth, the judgment of the heart, and the promise of resurrection were gradually absorbed into the mainstream of Egyptian belief. The cult did not defeat the state religion. It transformed it from within, fundamentally reshaping the spiritual landscape for everyone. If the dominant religion of an era was ultimately shaped by its need to combat and then absorb a forgotten rival faith, how does that change our understanding of its most cherished doctrines? It reveals that religious orthodoxy is rarely a monolithic truth handed down from on high. It is often a compromise, a tapestry woven from the threads of many spiritual battles, its doctrines shaped as much by the rivals it defeated as by the truths it professed. This search for ultimate meaning, whether in the heavens or in the soul, would soon be channeled into a new and equally fierce competition, one that would harness the very forces of nature to unleash a power previously reserved for the gods. The Golden Throne was never truly empty, yet it was always contested. In the hushed corridors of power surrounding an aging emperor, the most critical battles for succession were fought not with swords after his death, but with whispers and promises while he still drew breath. This was the Presuccession Shadow War, a silent, intricate contest between royal heirs and their factions that often predetermined the future of an empire more decisively than any open civil war. The Byzantine court historian Procopius, in his scandalous secret history, peeled back the gilded curtain on this world, exposing the brutal infighting, the character assassinations, and the strategic poisonings that official chronicles carefully omitted. These conflicts were waged with subtler, more devastating weapons. Ambitious heirs forged marriage alliances to secure the loyalty of powerful noble houses. They competed in lavish public patronage, building aqueducts and hosting games to win the favor of the city's populace. They offered lucrative posts and economic privileges to draw the empire's best military commanders and wealthiest merchants into their personal orbits. This shadow war fundamentally shaped both foreign and domestic policy for decades. An heir seeking an edge might secretly negotiate with a neighboring kingdom, pledging future concessions or a more favorable peace treaty in exchange for their military backing when the time came. Domestically, they were forced to prove their administrative competence, often being given control of a province as a test, their performance there becoming a powerful piece of propaganda for their faction. Influential family members became crucial power brokers in this deadly game. A queen mother, possessing unparalleled access to the emperor and a deep network of alliances, could make or break a prince's ambitions. Younger siblings, powerful uncles, and even the emperor's favored courtiers all became pieces on a political chessboard, their loyalties constantly probed and purchased. The most successful heirs went a step further, creating entire parallel administrations within the empire, complete with their own treasuries, secretariats, and private spies, effectively running a state within a state as they prepared for the ultimate transition of power. The cost of this constant, low-grade conflict could be catastrophic. While the heirs fought for the throne, the business of governing the empire often faltered. Tax collection grew inefficient, border defenses were neglected, and the state's resources were diverted to fuel the rival factions. This internal rot created a profound vulnerability, leaving the empire exposed to external enemies who watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. A stark, forgotten example of this dynamic unraveled in the Great Khmer Empire. For decades, the sons of a powerful emperor engaged in a protracted rivalry, not on the battlefield but through cultural and religious patronage. One son aligned himself with one Buddhist sect, funding magnificent temples and supporting its monks. His brother, in response, patronized a rival sect, building his own equally grand monastic complexes. Their competition was not for land or armies, but for the soul of the empire itself. This created two distinct, powerful power centers that fragmented the court and the priesthood. After their father's death, this schism, rarely highlighted in the grand accounts of Angkor's splendor, prevented a unified succession and contributed significantly to the empire's gradual decline. The so-called Golden Age was, in reality, a period of intense, hidden conflict. This forces us to question our very periodization of history. An era remembered for its peace and prosperity might have been, behind the palace walls, a simmering cauldron of dynastic intrigue that planted the seeds of future collapse. The fragility of dynastic power was its open secret, a weakness often exploited not by foreign invaders, but by the very administrators and scribes who managed the day-to-day machinery of the state, the quiet custodians who held the real keys to power. The quiet scratch of a reed pen on papyrus proved mightier than the sword. Deep within the palace archives, a new kind of power was being born, not on the battlefield, but in the meticulous columns of a tax ledger and the carefully worded draft of a royal decree. This was the silent coup of the bureaucrat, a slow-burning war between the emerging class of literate administrators and the old warrior nobility, a conflict that would transform personal rule into the cold, enduring machinery of the state. The Chinese philosopher Han Fei Tzu saw this future clearly, arguing that a state governed by clear laws and a professional bureaucracy was infinitely stronger than one reliant on the whims of aristocratic privilege. His ideas guided a quiet revolution where the power of pedigree was systematically dismantled by the power of paperwork. The administrator's weapon was specialized knowledge. They alone understood the arcane complexities of tax assessment, the precedents buried in legal archives, and the logistical nightmare of supplying a distant army. This made them utterly indispensable. A noble could win a glorious victory, but only a clerk could ensure the troops were paid and fed, making the clerk's influence far more consistent and pervasive. In response, the old aristocracy fought back with the tools they understood. They clung to prestigious military commands and forged desperate marriage alliances with the royal family, trying to leverage their bloodlines and martial honor against this new, faceless power. But their world of personal loyalty and inherited status was ill-suited to a system increasingly built on records and regulations. This tension frequently erupted in violence. A threatened nobility, seeing its influence wane, would occasionally instigate a brutal purge of the bureaucracy, accusing the clerks of corruption or treason in a bloody effort to reset the balance of power. A profound example of this struggle, often obscured by tales of absolute sultans, unfolded within the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, a delicate and deadly rivalry existed between the traditional Turkish nobility and the devshirme, an administrative class recruited from non-Muslim subjects. These men, educated and converted to Islam, were lifted from obscurity to become the empire's viziers, tax collectors, and scribes. Their loyalty was to the sultan alone, not to any ancient clan or tribal affiliation. The Turkish nobles viewed these outsiders with contempt and fear, seeing them as usurpers who had stolen their birthright through mere competence. This rivalry shaped imperial policy in countless ways, influencing military campaigns, tax reforms, and the very structure of the Ottoman court, all while being framed publicly as the unquestioned will of the Sultan. The most lasting innovation born from this conflict was the civil service examination. Systems like the famed Chinese imperial exams were designed to create a merit-based, or at least education-based, administrative class. Their true purpose, however, was to break the nobility's stranglehold on power by creating a parallel path to influence, one that rewarded study over lineage. This institutionalized the bureaucracy, making it a permanent feature of the landscape, separate from the ruler's personal household. The state was no longer just the king and his loyal warriors. It was now a vast, impersonal entity with its own rules, its own memory, and its own interests. So if the laws that governed your ancestors were written not by a king in a moment of inspiration, but by a class of faceless clerks engaged in a centuries-long power struggle with an old aristocracy, a haunting question remains. Where does true sovereignty lie? Is it with the figurehead on the throne, or with the anonymous hands that control the information, the money, and the very words of the law? This bureaucratic rivalry built the framework of the modern world, but its victory was so complete that we often forget it was ever a contest at all. And as these administrators solidified their control over the machinery of state, a new and even more personal rivalry was brewing, one that would pit the artist against their own patron in a struggle for creative soul. A glass beaker could hold either a path to spiritual enlightenment or a simple chemical reaction, but never both at once. This was the schism in the laboratory, a silent war over the soul of matter itself, fought between the alchemist, who saw the universe as a living text of divine symbols, and the early chemist, who began to see it as a complex machine. Their rivalry marked the violent birth of modern science from the womb of mystical tradition. The alchemist pursued transformation on every level, believing that purifying base metals into gold was inseparable from purifying the human soul. His world was one of hidden correspondences, where the color of a flame or the formation of a crystal revealed a deeper spiritual truth. The chemist, in contrast, began to methodically strip away the symbolism. He focused on weight, measurement, and repeatable reactions, seeking not to unlock cosmic secrets, but to understand the predictable behavior of substances. This was a conflict between two irreconcilable ways of knowing. The enigmatic figure of Paracelsus stands as a monument to this duality. He was a practicing alchemist who searched for the elixir of life, yet his relentless experimentation with minerals for medicine yielded genuine advances that would inform pharmacology for centuries. His work defies easy categorization, embodying the very tension of the age. The alchemists, in their obsessive quest for the philosopher's stone, developed the foundational toolkit of chemistry through sheer trial and error. Their secretive work in dusty laboratories gave us sophisticated furnaces, the processes of distillation and sublimation, and the first isolations of new elements. They created the raw data, the messy, unclassified observations that the new chemists would later clean, organize, and build upon. This competition for legitimacy was fought with the power of patronage. A prince might fund an alchemist's workshop in the desperate hope of replenishing the royal treasury with manufactured gold. That same prince might also employ a chemist to develop better metal alloys for cannons or more reliable dyes for the textile trade. The alchemist promised mythical wealth, the chemist offered practical advantage, and the rivalry between them forced a clarification of results. To protect their hard-won knowledge from rivals and to avoid charges of heresy, alchemists wrote in a labyrinth of coded language and obscure symbols. A recipe might be described as the marriage of the Red King and the White Queen, its true meaning accessible only to the initiated. This secrecy was both a shield and a barrier, preserving knowledge while also preventing the open scrutiny and collaboration that would become the hallmark of modern science. The philosophical divide became intensely personal in the feud between two 16th-century figures at the court of Rudolf II in Prague. One was a dedicated alchemist consumed by the search for the stone, his work shrouded in mystical rituals. The other was an iatrocchemist, a chemist who believed the true purpose of their art was to prepare healing medicines through precise distillations. They engaged in a bitter war of pamphlets, each publicly mocking the other's methods. The alchemist accused the iatrocchemist of being a mere mechanic with no understanding of the soul of matter. The iatrocchemist, in turn, dismissed the alchemist's work as unsystematic fantasy, arguing that his own reproducible results with medicinal elixirs proved the superiority of a materialist approach. Their very public spat helped to crystallize the boundaries between the two fields. So when we look back and draw a clean line between the magic of alchemy and the rigor of chemistry, we are telling ourselves a comforting story. The truth is far messier. The first chemists did not simply abandon the alchemist's quest, they redirected it. They took the same furnaces, the same glassware, and the same burning curiosity, and applied a new kind of skepticism. The struggle to transform metal was, in the end, a prelude to the struggle to transform life, a battle over the human body that would be fought not with mystical elixirs, but with the cold, precise tools of medicine. The royal bedchamber was a theater of silent terror, thick with the scent of herbs and fear. Here, a king's fever was not merely an illness, but a political crisis, and the physicians at his bedside were not just healers, but gladiators in a contest where the stakes were a crown and their own necks. This was the deadly rivalry of the court physicians, a clash where medical theory became a weapon and the monarch's body was the ultimate prize. Two doctors could look at the same ailing ruler and see completely different realities. One, a staunch traditionalist, would diagnose an imbalance of the four humors, prescribing bloodletting to restore equilibrium according to the ancient wisdom of Galen. His rival, a progressive, might argue for a new chemical remedy, a potent distillation that challenged everything the old god held sacred. Their debate over a treatment plan was a high-stakes argument over the future of medicine itself. The French barber-surgeon Ambroise Paré experienced this tension at its most extreme. On a battlefield faced with gunshot wounds, he ran out of the boiling oil traditionally used to cauterize injuries. In desperation, he applied a simple, gentle digestive of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. Dreading the outcome, he expected to find the men dead from gangrene by morning. Instead, he discovered them resting comfortably, their wounds far cleaner than those treated with the agonizing hot oil. This single moment of forced innovation, born from a lack of traditional supplies, directly challenged centuries of established practice and catapulted him to royal favor, making enemies of every physician who clung to the old ways. These rivalries were intensified by the deliberate recruitment of foreign doctors. A monarch, desperate for a cure, would import a healer from Italy or the Ottoman Empire, hoping their exotic methods could succeed where local physicians had failed. This outsider, with his strange theories and unfamiliar potions, would immediately become a target for the entrenched medical establishment, who saw him not as a colleague, but as a threat to their prestige and income. The most dangerous weapon in this silent war was the accusation of poisoning. If a king's health declined under a rival's care, the charge of malpractice could easily escalate to a charge of treason. A physician's failure was not seen as a simple error in judgment, but as a potential act of regicide, a convenient excuse for political factions to eliminate a disliked doctor and his patrons. The outcomes of these personal battles in the sick room dictated the medical knowledge of entire nations. The winning physicians favored medical texts would be the ones translated, published, and taught to the next generation of doctors. A theory backed by royal survival became dogma, while the losing approach, however valid, was often relegated to the margins of history. A particularly telling case consumed the court of a Habsburg emperor plagued by debilitating gout. Two physicians waged a bitter war over his treatment. One advocated a strict, nearly starvation-level dietary regimen to purge the corrupt humors he believed caused the pain. The other championed the use of a newly discovered mineral water from a local spring, touting its purifying properties. The emperor, caught between their conflicting counsel, vacillated for years, his suffering prolonged by their professional feud. The doctor promoting the water eventually gained the upper hand, and his success popularized the spa town, influencing the rise of therapeutic bath culture across Europe for centuries. So much of our medical heritage rests on these forgotten moments of chance and ambition. If the treatment that became standard for a generation was decided not by its efficacy for the common person, but by which doctor won a desperate power struggle in a single royal bedchamber, how can we trust the linear story of medical progress? The health of the body politic was so intertwined with the health of the ruler's body that the same fierce rivalries would soon erupt over the physical defenses that protected them both. The health of the king and the health of the kingdom both depended on a single, stark reality, the unbreachable wall. Along a windswept border, two teams of engineers watched each other, their gazes tracing the rising stone of a rival's new fortress. This silent, technical dialogue in stone and siegecraft was a relentless arms race that drove the evolution of military architecture for centuries. It was a perfect cycle of challenge and response. A revolutionary defensive feature, like the rounded tower designed to deflect siege projectiles, would appear in one kingdom. Its rivals' engineers would immediately study it, and within a few years, they would develop a more powerful trebuchet or a new mining technique to overcome it. This iterative process forced a breathtaking pace of innovation. The Crusades became the ultimate laboratory for this exchange. European knights, accustomed to their own square keeps, encountered the sophisticated concentric castles of the Levant, designs with multiple, layered walls that created killing zones for defenders. They brought these ideas home, and Islamic engineers, in turn, studied the European improvements, leading to a rapid, pan-Mediterranean advancement in the art of fortification and destruction. This rivalry birthed the concentric castle, a fortress within a fortress, the deadly barbican, a fortified gateway that funneled attackers into a death trap, and ever more complex gatehouses with multiple portcullises and murder holes. The response was equally fierce, spurring the development of massive counterweight trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, and eventually the earth-shattering arrival of early gunpowder weapons that would render high, thin walls obsolete. The competition for talent was ruthless. Kings would pay fortunes to hire enemy engineers who had defected or been captured, valuing their intimate knowledge of the rivals' latest designs. Espionage was rampant, with agents tasked with stealing architectural plans or bribing stonemasons for the secrets of a fortress's weak points. The economic impact of this race was staggering. Building these colossal structures was so expensive it could cripple a kingdom's treasury as surely as a lost battle. A little documented wall race between the kingdoms of France and Burgundy in the 14th century saw each power trying to outbuild the other with a chain of modernized fortresses. This competition drained their treasuries and permanently reshaped the landscape of the region with stone, leaving behind a line of majestic, bankrupting sentinels. So when you walk through the ruins of a great castle, you are not just seeing a static monument, you are witnessing one half of a forgotten conversation, a specific rebuttal in stone to a rival's fortress just across the valley. Its every curve and killing ground was an argument in an ongoing debate about security and power. And just as kingdoms competed to build the strongest walls, their rulers fought an equally fierce battle to project the most dazzling cultural prestige, a war waged not with catapults but with art and theater. The gilded frame around a Renaissance masterpiece held more than paint, it held a declaration of war. In the grand salons of Florence, the true battle for supremacy was not fought with armies, but with brushes and chisels, a silent, opulent conflict where the Medici family and their rivals, the Pazzi and the Strozzi, used cultural capital as their ultimate weapon. Their patronage was never pure philanthropy. It was a calculated form of political propaganda, a way to demonstrate wealth, taste, and divine favor so overwhelming that it legitimized their rule and cemented their legacy as the true guardians of civilization. This fierce competition for artistic glory became a powerful, unseen engine for innovation, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in art, music, and thought. Artists caught in the middle of these clashing egos found their own power growing. A sculptor coveted by both the Medici and the Strozzi could suddenly demand higher pay, better materials, and something even more precious, greater creative freedom. Patrons desperate to outshine their rivals were often willing to fund riskier, more experimental work, knowing that a single groundbreaking painting or sculpture could bring them immortal prestige. This led to a remarkable clustering of talent in cities like Florence and Venice, creating the concentrated creative explosions we now call golden ages. The rivalries manifested in brutally direct ways. Competing patrons would commission works on identical themes from different artists, forcing a public, head-to-head comparison of genius. They engaged in rampant poaching, luring away a rival's favored painter or composer with promises of lavish studios, higher commissions, and the chance to work on more ambitious projects. These contests were not always gentlemanly. They could turn vicious, involving sabotage of rival commissions, the defamation of an artist's character to tarnish a patron's reputation, and in extreme cases, even violence. A largely forgotten but telling example played out between two minor German princes in the 18th century. Their petty competition to establish the finest court orchestra and the most magnificent opera house in their region seemed like a local vanity project. Yet this very rivalry created an environment of intense musical demand and opportunity. It inadvertently nurtured several young composers and musicians, providing them with steady work, performance experience, and the space to hone their craft. Several of these artists would later leave those small courts to achieve international fame, their talent first cultivated in the hothouse of a princely feud. So if the masterpiece you stand in awe of today exists primarily because two wealthy men were locked in a bitter contest to humiliate one another, does that knowledge diminish the art or somehow deepen it? It forces us to see that the cultivation of high culture, the very foundation of our artistic heritage, was often a deliberate and ruthless strategy in a broader, unending rivalry for soft power. And as these patrons fought their wars with beauty, another, even more personal conflict was unfolding, a struggle for the very soul of the creative individual. A single word could be an act of treason in the quiet halls of the Language Academy. Here, scholars appointed as guardians of linguistic purity watched with horror as poets and playwrights returned from abroad, their work teeming with foreign phrases and vulgar street slang. This was a war over the soul of civilization's most vital tool, a conflict between those who saw language as a sacred, unchanging monument to the past and those who treated it as a living, breathing entity that had to evolve. The purists argued for stability, for a language that preserved cultural identity and ensured clarity across generations. The innovators saw a language that refused to change as a language that was already dead, incapable of describing a world transformed by new ideas, new technologies, and new social realities. The founding of the French Academy in the 17th century was a direct, institutional response to this fear. Its mission was to defend the French language from corruption, to act as a fortress against the tidal wave of new words and influences. This struggle was never just about grammar. It was a proxy for a much larger political and cultural war between traditionalists and modernizers. The purists' most powerful weapon was the official dictionary, a monumental effort to standardize, define, and ultimately fossilize the language, freezing it in an idealized state. Yet the innovators had their own arena, the vibrant, popular world of the theater and the novel. A playwright like Molière could pack his comedies with the very colloquial speech the Academy despised, and through the laughter of the crowd, those new words gained a powerful legitimacy no decree could erase. The outcome of this silent war determined nothing less than a nation's relationship with its own history. A language preserved in amber could make ancient texts feel immediate and accessible centuries later, but it risked becoming a sterile relic. A language allowed to run wild became a vibrant, chaotic reflection of its time, but it could render the literature of its own past a foreign country. A dramatic and largely forgotten example of this conflict erupted in 19th century Russia, known to a few historians as the Verb War. On one side stood the Slavophiles, intellectuals who advocated for a return to the pure, old church Slavonic roots of the language, seeing Western influence as a spiritual poison. Arrayed against them were the Westernizers, who argued that for Russia to progress, its language must openly embrace loanwords from French and German to describe new concepts in philosophy, science, and government. This was not a polite academic debate. It was fought with fierce essays in literary journals, with public lectures that turned into shouting matches, and in the very sentences of the era's greatest novelists who had to choose which linguistic path their characters would walk. The struggle directly shaped the development of modern Russian, determining which words would feel native and which would forever carry the faint echo of a foreign land. If the very words you used to think and feel were ultimately shaped by the outcome of a centuries-old argument between purists and innovators, a haunting question remains. How free is your own thought, the vocabulary available to you, the structures you use to form a sentence? These are the invisible boundaries of your mind, built by a rivalry you never knew existed. This reveals the profound power dynamics embedded in language itself, a reminder that the form of communication is one battleground, while the stories told with that language became another, equally fierce arena of conflict. The royal library smelled of cedar oil and quiet authority. Here, the official historian's pen glided across the page, recording a dynasty's reign as a seamless epic of wisdom and divine favor. Miles away, in a cold monastery cell, a different kind of ink stained the hands of a dissident monk. His secret chronicle told of the same years, but his pages whispered of famine, court corruption, and military blunders, the truths the official version meticulously erased. This was the most fundamental rivalry of all, a clandestine war over truth itself, waged between the state-sanctioned narrative and the subversive counter-narrative that refused to be silenced. The Roman historian Tacitus saw this gulf with brutal clarity, observing that the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws, a testament to the widening chasm between official proclamations and lived reality. This struggle forced history to live a double life. One version was a polished monument, a tool of propaganda designed to legitimize the current order. The other was a raw, often dangerous record of events, however inconvenient they might be for those in power. To protect their fragile truths, dissident voices developed ingenious methods of survival. When writing direct history was tantamount to a death sentence, they turned to allegory and fiction. A seemingly innocent fable about a foolish lion king could be a scathing critique of a tyrannical ruler, its true meaning understood by everyone but provable to no one. Exile became another sanctuary for memory. Communities forced from their homelands became living libraries, preserving songs, stories, and alternative records that kept a vanquished culture's past alive, waiting for the day it could be spoken aloud once more. A profound example of this entire dynamic unfolded during China's Ming Dynasty. The official Bureau of Historiography produced the meticulous, sterile, veritable records, the authorized story of the empire. But operating in the shadows was a network of independent scholars who compiled what they called yesi, or wild histories. These unofficial accounts, based on oral testimony from merchants and soldiers and on the personal observations of minor officials, captured the gritty texture of life, the gossip of the tea houses, and the true cost of imperial policies. For generations, these wild histories were dismissed as unreliable rumor. But when the Ming Dynasty fell, it was these very texts that historians turned to in order to understand what truly happened behind the glittering facade of the court. The dissident view achieved its triumph long after its authors were gone. This presents us with the central dilemma of all historical knowledge. If the first history you were ever taught was primarily the product of a winner's determined effort to scrub away every dissenting voice, how can you ever be certain of what truly happened? The fight to control the past was never about the past at all. It was the opening move in the fight to command the future, a battle that would soon shift from the written word to the very frontiers of the human mind. The quiet cloisters of a new university were never as peaceful as they appeared. Behind the solemn lectures and copying of manuscripts, a different kind of education was happening, a ruthless contest for the future of the mind itself. In a fledgling European nation, two great universities rose almost in lockstep, each backed by a rival bishop or a different religious order. Their competition was not for land or titles, but for something far more enduring: intellectual preeminence. This institutional rivalry, often rooted in deep theological or philosophical splits, created the very model of the modern university, forcing an explosion of new knowledge as each institution fought to prove its superiority. The frantic need to attract the finest scholars and the most promising students from across the continent drove a constant expansion of what could be studied. A single, static curriculum was a liability in this race. To outshine its competitor, a university had to establish new, separate faculties for law, medicine, and natural philosophy, creating the academic disciplines we recognize today. The entire structure of higher education was born from this pressure to offer more, to be more comprehensive, and to command greater prestige than the school in the next kingdom. The founding of the University of Paris and the University of Oxford was a direct extension of the broader political and religious rivalry between the English and French crowns. Each institution became a proxy in a larger Cold War, a living symbol of national and doctrinal strength. This competition fostered a vibrant, often explosive, culture of debate. It also led to dramatic schisms, where entire faculties of disgruntled masters would pack their books and migrate en masse to the rival institution, carrying new ideas with them and ensuring that knowledge could never be fully contained by one walled garden. The weapons in this war were papal and royal charters, securing the right privileges from a pope or a king to grant degrees, to hold independent courts, or to be exempt from local taxes was a masterstroke that could cripple a rival for a generation. The competition extended to physical splendor as well, with each university striving to build the most impressive library, the most capacious lecture hall, and the most majestic chapel, using architecture as a permanent advertisement for their intellectual and spiritual wealth. This pursuit of status could erupt into shocking violence. Students from competing universities, often divided by nationality as much as by alma mater, would frequently clash in the town streets, turning academic rivalry into bloody town and gown riots that required royal intervention to quell. A forgotten but potent example of this dynamic was the intense competition between the early universities of Salamanca and Valladolid in Spain. Their struggle for royal favor and papal recognition was not a polite contest. It was a fierce battle that helped define the distinct tradition of scholasticism in the Iberian Peninsula, as each institution championed slightly different interpretations of doctrine and method to attract the best minds and the most powerful patrons. If the entire university system that educated your nation's leaders, scientists, and artists was born from a fierce, centuries-long competition between two medieval bishops, how does that legacy of institutional one-upmanship shape the modern quest for knowledge? It reveals that the ivory tower was never an isolated sanctuary, but a fortress in a perpetual, hidden war for the mind. And just as universities competed in the realm of pure thought, a parallel and equally fierce rivalry was unfolding in the world of practical, hands-on creation. The salty air of a rival shipyard carried the scent of state secrets. In the noisy, tar-scented docks of competing maritime powers, the true battle for empire was fought not by admirals, but by master shipwrights wielding adzes and blueprints. This was a silent, technical war where a few inches of hull curvature or a new arrangement of sails could determine the fate of continents, a relentless race to build a vessel that was faster, more maneuverable, and more seaworthy than anything a rival nation could produce. The Portuguese caravel, with its mix of square and lateen sails that allowed it to sail remarkably close to the wind, was a direct response to the challenge of exploring the treacherous West African coast. The Spanish galleon, a heavier, more robust floating fortress, was its natural successor, designed to carry the staggering wealth of the New World back across the Atlantic. This rivalry fueled a cascade of innovations that we now take for granted. The sternpost rudder, mounted on the back of the ship, gave sailors unprecedented control compared to the old side-steering oars. The adoption of the triangular lateen sail from Arab traders allowed ships to tack against the wind, turning the open ocean from a barrier into a highway. Even the slow, relentless growth of barnacles and shipworms became a front in this war, leading to the practice of copper sheathing hulls to protect them and maintain a ship's speed. These were not just incremental improvements, they were strategic advantages so vital that the plans for a new hull design were guarded with the same secrecy as military battle plans. The competition for the minds and hands that could execute these designs was ruthless. Kings authorized the outright kidnapping of skilled shipwrights from rival nations, offering them fortunes to defect. When a new enemy vessel was captured, it was not simply pressed into service. It was hauled into dry dock and meticulously taken apart, its every joint and line measured and drawn by teams of royal shipwrights desperate to understand and copy its secrets. Private investors and powerful trading companies like the English East India Company became major drivers of this innovation, funding experimental designs in the hope of gaining a crucial edge in the race for spices and silks. A profound, yet largely obscured, technological arms race was the clash between the clinker and carvel methods of shipbuilding. The shipwrights of the Hanseatic League, masters of the Baltic and North Seas, clung to the traditional clinker technique, where overlapping planks created a strong, flexible hull ideal for northern waters. The emerging Atlantic powers, Portugal and Spain, championed the carvel method, fitting planks edge to edge onto a rigid internal frame. This created a smoother, stronger hull capable of carrying more cargo and mounting heavier cannons, the very foundation of the ocean-going galleon. The slow, reluctant shift from clinker to carvel was a quiet revolution that determined which nations would rule the waves and which would be left behind. If the ship that carried colonists to a new world was the result of a century-long, hidden competition between two groups of carpenters arguing over the best way to join pieces of wood, a startling question emerges. How much of our modern world was shaped not by grand geopolitical strategy, but by the quiet genius of anonymous craftsmen? This elevates the shipwright from a simple laborer to a central architect of history. Yet mastering the vessel was only half the battle. The true master of the seas was the wind itself, and the next great rivalry would be over who could best predict its invisible path. A king's fleet lay at anchor, its fate hanging not on a rival navy but on an approaching bank of clouds. In the royal chambers, two men offered competing prophecies. One was a grizzled farmer who read the ache in his bones and the flight of the swallows. The other was a scholar who pointed to the falling mercury in his strange glass tube. This was the ultimate test of foresight, a clash between ancient, embodied wisdom and a new, mechanical oracle. The farmer's knowledge was a deep library of local patterns, passed down through generations. He knew that a halo around the moon meant rain, that red skies at morning were a specific warning for shepherds. His understanding was empirical, born of a lifetime of watching and correlating nature's subtle signs. The scholar, armed with his newly invented thermometer and barometer, saw a different reality. He believed weather was not a collection of omens, but a physical system governed by universal laws of pressure and temperature that could be measured, recorded, and ultimately predicted anywhere in the world. This rivalry transformed weather prediction from a matter of folklore into a science. The first systematic weather observation networks, established by rival scientific societies in the 17th century, were a direct outgrowth of this competition. These learned men began collecting daily measurements from across their countries, creating the first datasets in a race to prove their method's superiority over the local cunning folk and almanac writers. Naval powers became the most eager patrons of this new science. For an empire whose wealth and security traveled by sail, understanding the wind was a strategic imperative. The quest to map the great wind patterns of the oceans, the trade winds and the westerlies, was a clandestine project as important as any map of coastlines. A dramatic and largely forgotten public feud in 18th century England crystallized this transition. A famous almanac publisher, whose annual forecasts of rain and sun were based on astrological charts and old rhymes, found his authority challenged by a member of the Royal Society. This scientist began publishing meticulous weather logs, comparing his instrument-based predictions to the almanac's vague prophecies. Their war of words, fought in pamphlets and newspapers, captivated the public. It was no longer a debate between two mystics, but a clear contest between superstition and data. The slow, undeniable accuracy of the barometer began to shift opinion, popularizing the radical idea that the weather was a natural phenomenon, not a message from capricious gods. Yet the victory of the instruments was not total. The early scientists were forced to validate their new tools against the observed reality that the farmers knew so well. They had to learn that a falling barometer did, in fact, often precede a storm, just as the old tales said. This dialogue between local knowledge and universal measurement preserved a wealth of practical wisdom that modern climate scientists are now urgently rediscovering, studying indigenous and folk records to understand long-term environmental cycles. So if the forecast that allowed a fleet to sail safely, changing the outcome of a war, was the result of a bitter argument between a man with a barometer and a man who listened to the crickets, which one truly served the king? The answer is both. The rivalry itself forced a more complete understanding, proving that the path to true knowledge often wins between the observant heart and the measuring mind. This slow mastery over the environment, however, would soon face its ultimate test as rival empires turned their attention to a new and even more volatile frontier, the very airwaves that carried information itself.